King John I ascended the Iron-and-Oak throne at the turn of the new century, 1800. If his father, George, had been the son that brought life and warmth to the nascent nation, John was the cool, disciplined steel that organized its structures. He possessed none of the charismatic general's easy charm. He was a bookish, intensely private man whose battlefield was the parliament floor and whose weapon was the meticulously crafted piece of legislation. He knew that the people respected his father, but they only tolerated him. His mission, therefore, was to ensure the monarchy survived not on personal appeal, but on institutional efficiency and unimpeachable governance. John's first major test came in the form of an international crisis, the escalating Napoleonic Wars in Europe. Both Great Britain and France, locked in a desperate struggle, viewed the growing, wealthy American Republic turned kingdom as a necessary resource and a potential military pawn. American merchant ships were routinely seized by both navies, their crews impressed or their cargo confiscated. The public clamored for war, divided along old political lines, some favoring the French, others the British. King John I and his new Prime Minister, Thomas Jefferson, found themselves in a rare alignment. They recognized that the young kingdom was militarily unprepared for a major European conflict. John utilized the crown's unique position as the unifier of foreign policy to propose the royal proclamation of armed neutrality. This was not the timid neutrality of a weak state, but the defiant neutrality of a determined one. The proclamation stated that the United States would trade with any nation, provided American sovereignty was respected. Furthermore, John rapidly expanded the fledgling Royal American Navy, investing heavily in advanced frigate designs and commissioning skilled commanders, many of whom were veterans of the Revolutionary Navy. The goal was not to challenge the massive European fleets, but to establish a highly mobile, effective coastal defense and convoy escort fleet capable of defending American commercial interests and ports. He funded this expansion not through direct taxation, which would cause unrest, but through the Western Land Sales Act. As the Western territories were surveyed and opened for settlement, the Crown held title to the land. John mandated that all sales proceeds be directly and exclusively dedicated to the Royal Navy. This created a profound link in the American consciousness. Expansion funds security. The king was using the nation's future wealth to protect its present commerce. The greatest success of John's reign came with the Louisiana acquisition in 1803. While the French Emperor Napoleon needed funds for his European campaigns, he was hesitant to sell the vast strategic territory to an unknown, unstable republic. John I personally handled the negotiation, sending his trusted emissary to Paris with a staggering offer in gold, backed by the stability of the royal bank. Napoleon, impressed by the monarchical stability and the guaranteed financial solvency of the American crown, agreed to the sale. The acquisition was a geopolitical earthquake, instantly doubling the size of the nation. But it presented a monumental challenge: how to govern and integrate this immense, diverse territory. King John I instituted the territorial governance mandate. He appointed royal governors for the new territories, individuals chosen not for political patronage, but for their proven administrative capabilities, often drawn from the pool of graduates of the Royal College. These governors were tasked with establishing law, building roads, and surveying the land, preparing the territories for statehood under the principles of the American Constitution and the Common Man's Charter. This rapid expansion exacerbated the kingdom's internal conflict, slavery. As new territories were carved out, the Southern aristocracy demanded the right to extend their institution into the West, threatening to destabilize the entire Union. John I, inheriting his father's moral repulsion, used the constitutional loophole available to the crown, the power to influence the settlement conditions on royal lands. He issued the Royal Decree on Western Settlement, which did not explicitly abolish slavery, but subtly strangled its extension. The decree offered massive land grants, tax incentives, and subsidized tools to any settler who signed an oath not to employ enslaved labor on their claim. The incentives were so powerful, especially for poor, ambitious Northern and European immigrants, that the vast majority of new settlers, particularly in the upper territories, chose the subsidized free labor model. The king effectively created a geographical barrier against the spread of slavery, subtly confining it without ever having to risk outright civil war through a direct legislative ban. The South saw the writing on the wall. The Crown was using economic forces to make their institution an economic and moral relic. As the second decade of his reign dawned, the king focused on the quality of life within the established states. He spearheaded the Royal Health and Sanitation Initiative. Recognizing the persistent scourge of urban disease, he established the Royal Medical Guild, granting charters to physicians who adhered to standardized practices, inspired by the translations of Greek and Arabic medicine his father had commissioned. He mandated the inspection and regulation of food markets and water sources in all major cities. This was governance at its most granular and effective, proving that the monarchy was concerned with the daily well-being of its lowest subject. However, John I's lack of warmth and his obsession with order occasionally led to political overreach. In 1812, Parliament, led by a faction wary of the Crown's growing influence, attempted to pass the Judicial Oversight Act, which would have allowed Parliament to remove royal-appointed judges. The king saw this as a direct attack on the judiciary's independence and the Crown's constitutional role as the guarantor of justice. In a rare public display of force, John I vetoed the bill, the first and only royal veto in Athelgardian history, and delivered a thundering address to Parliament. He reminded them that the Constitution separated powers for a reason. The legislative branch is the heart of the people's will, which is fleeting. The judiciary is the spine of the law, which must be eternal. If you remove the judges who enforce the king's justice, you remove the people's shield against your own arbitrary power. The king prevailed, solidifying the independence and impartiality of the royal court system. John I's reign was a necessary period of consolidation. His father had won the crown, John I made the crown work. He secured the borders, paid the debts, established the rule of law across a continent-sized nation, and built the institutional scaffolding of the American monarchy. He died peacefully in 1826, leaving behind a nation twice the size, a stable national currency, and a political system that was both dynamic and durable. The third generation brought a new kind of challenge. King William I, who ascended the throne at the age of 30, inherited his grandfather's charisma and his father's intellect, blending them with a new progressive energy. William I was the first king born and raised entirely under the Constitution, embodying the American experiment. His era coincided with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. William I immediately grasped the transformative power of steam and iron. He saw that the king's roads, the pride of George I, were becoming obsolete. His first great initiative was the Royal Charter for Internal Improvement, dedicating massive crown funds and issuing long-term bonds to finance the construction of the nation's first extensive railway network. This was an engineering marvel that connected the thriving eastern ports to the recently settled western territories. The royal railways broke the tyranny of geography, making settlements safer, faster, and more affordable. It allowed the agricultural produce of the Midwest to reach the urban markets of the East, creating immense wealth for farmers and fueling the growth of major cities like Chicago and St. Louis. The railways were symbolic. They literally connected the disparate states into a single cohesive economic unit, making the notion of secession economically suicidal. William I also understood the power of public opinion. Unlike his reclusive father, William I utilized the popular press and the new technology of the railway to travel ceaselessly across the kingdom. These royal progresses were public spectacles.
the king would disembark at newly built rail stations, engaging in spontaneous conversations with factory workers and immigrant farmers. He actively projected the image of the citizen king, a monarch who was educated, modern, and accessible. His personal popularity became the political currency he used to push for necessary reforms against entrenched interests.
The most formidable foe William I faced was the political machine of the Southern aristocracy. They were richer than ever thanks to the cotton boom, yet increasingly isolated and hostile due to the Crown's policies limiting slavery's expansion. They operated under the leadership of Senator Calhoun of South Carolina, a brilliant orator who demanded the Crown respect state sovereignty over matters of labor. William I met this challenge not with force, but with economic counterpower. He commissioned a Royal Commission on Labor Practices, which published a widely distributed report documenting the superior productivity and innovation of free labor enterprises in the North compared to the stagnant, capital-intensive plantations of the South. Furthermore, he initiated the Immigration and Manufacturing Act, aggressively funding campaigns in Germany, Ireland, and Scandinavia, offering cheap land in the western non-slave states and guaranteeing jobs in the burgeoning northern textile and iron mills. The North was flooded with millions of ambitious, loyal, free laborers who had an economic incentive to support the Crown's vision. The South, meanwhile, was increasingly reliant on a single, morally indefensible labor source and was being outpaced in every measure of economic growth and technological adoption. The kingdom was dividing, not just by ideology, but by rapidly diverging economic structures, a testament to the long-term effectiveness of George I and John I's careful, indirect policies. William I was also a devoted patron of the arts and sciences. He oversaw the establishment of the Royal Academy of Sciences and the National Gallery of American Art, centralizing the nation's intellectual and cultural life in the capital. He personally secured funding for the construction of great public libraries in every major city, enshrining the principle that education was a right, not a privilege. His reign was marked by a spirit of optimism and progress. He signed landmark legislation mandating the first compulsory public schooling, establishing a standard minimum curriculum across the states. He championed the cause of the burgeoning women's rights movement, quietly encouraging Parliament to pass the Married Women's Property Act, which allowed women to own and control property independently of their husbands, a silent revolution that gave women economic autonomy. By 1845, the kingdom was the most powerful industrial and financial force in the world. The American flag, the stars and stripes, flying beneath the royal standard, represented both democratic accountability and monarchical stability. But the question of slavery remained an open, festering wound. The southern states, seeing themselves hemmed in and rendered culturally obsolete, began to whisper the fatal word: secession. William I, recognizing that the long-game strategies of his predecessors had run their course, understood that the issue would have to be confronted directly. The moral bankruptcy of holding human beings as property was now too obvious, and the economic division too profound. He began privately meeting with the leaders of the Northern Parliament, drafting a final, non-negotiable proposal: compensated emancipation. The Crown would use its vast wealth and credit to buy the freedom of all enslaved persons over a 30-year period, offering the planters market value for their human property, thus removing the economic argument against abolition. It was the last, desperate attempt at peace. Senator Calhoun's response was immediate and absolute: "The king may buy our labor, but he will not buy our sovereignty." The South rejected the proposal, seeing it not as compromise, but a humiliation and the final act of control by the Crown. The stage was set for the ultimate conflict of the American monarchy, a conflict that George I had feared and John II had worked tirelessly to avoid. William I knew his reign would be defined not by the railroads and libraries he built, but by the war he was about to fight to preserve the unity his grandfather had created.
The era of peaceful progress was over. The age of reckoning had begun. The confrontation that defined King William I's reign began not with a cannon shot, but with a piece of paper, the Ordinance of Nullification, passed by the South Carolina legislature in 1849. The ordinance declared the federal tariffs and the Royal Manumission Fund Acts null and void within state borders, threatening secession if the Crown attempted enforcement. The ghost of division, which had haunted the American project since its inception, had finally materialized. William I's response was swift and resolute, a perfect blend of his grandfather's authority and his father's legal precision. He issued the Royal Proclamation to the people of South Carolina, declaring nullification incompatible with the existence of the Union and reaffirming the supremacy of the Constitution, which the Crown was sworn to uphold. He did not issue a declaration of war, but a declaration of constitutional duty. He moved immediately to secure the federal fortresses within the state, sending the Royal Navy to reinforce the harbor defenses of Charleston. Crucially, he did not rely solely on military force. He used the extensive network of the Royal Railways to flood the northern and western newspapers with copies of the Constitution, the Royal Proclamation, and the Common Man's Charter. The message was simple. The South was fighting not for freedom, but for the right to enslave others and to dismantle the hard-won Union that secured the prosperity of the North and West. The response from the southern states was a cascading withdrawal. One by one, state legislatures, fueled by the rhetoric of Senator Calhoun and the fear of losing their economic foundation, ratified ordinances of secession. By the spring of 1850, 11 states had formed the Confederate States of America, establishing their own government and electing a provisional president. The American Civil War had begun. William I knew that a military victory alone would not suffice. The war had to be fought and won on moral and political grounds. He understood that the institution of slavery was the root of the conflict, and he refused to let the war be framed merely as a battle over tariffs and states' rights. The king personally took command of the Royal American Army, appointing the most brilliant strategist, General Ulysses S. Grant, to lead the main Western campaign, and the disciplined, though often cautious, General George Meade to command the Eastern forces. The North held the overwhelming advantage in industry, finance, due to the stability of the Royal Bank and rail infrastructure, all of which were legacies of the Crown's investments. The Royal Navy, born from the Treaty of the Iron Coast and expanded by John I, immediately enacted a devastating blockade of southern ports, choking the flow of cotton exports and vital imports. The war was brutal and protracted. Early Confederate victories, such as the major engagement at Manassas, instilled a false confidence in the South. But the Crown's industrial capacity was an endless wellspring of supplies, men, and material. The decisive turn came in 1853 with the Royal Decree of Emancipation. Issued on the anniversary of George I's birth, the decree declared all enslaved persons in the Confederate States to be forever free. This was a stroke of strategic brilliance. It immediately transformed the nature of the conflict into a war of liberation, denying European powers, especially Britain and France, who had already abolished slavery, any moral justification to intervene on the side of the Confederacy. Furthermore, it authorized the creation of royal colored regiments, allowing formerly enslaved men to join the fight, bringing vital manpower and profound moral commitment to the Crown's cause. The image of former slaves fighting under the American flag, now consecrated by the Crown as the symbol of freedom, was a powerful international diplomatic tool. The war dragged on until 1855. General Grant's relentless campaign in the West, coupled with the slow strangulation of the Southern economy by the blockade, eventually broke the Confederate will. The final surrender occurred at Appomattox, where the King's representative, Grant, accepted the terms not with triumphalism, but with solemn respect.
The most difficult challenge followed: Reconstruction. Unlike the vengeful approach favored by some radical members of Parliament, William I insisted on a policy of restoration and reconciliation. He understood that the Union could not survive if the South was left impoverished and resentful. His plan, the proclamation of royal amnesty, offered pardons to almost all Confederate soldiers and citizens, excluding only the highest-ranking political and military leaders. Crucially, he oversaw the immediate ratification of the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery nationwide, and the 14th Amendment, granting citizenship and equal protection under the law to the newly freed population. To rebuild the devastated South, William I implemented the Royal Land Resettlement and Education Act. The Crown did not seize private property, but it directed vast federal resources to create the Freedmen's Education and Labor Bureau. This bureau was tasked with establishing public schools for formerly enslaved children and adults, and creating contracts between landowners and the new freed laborers, providing mediation and legal support to prevent the re-establishment of peonage. The king himself commissioned the construction of the Great Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, viewing education as the only true path to long-term equity. The king's emphasis on reconciliation meant he faced political opposition from both sides: the defeated Southern aristocracy who hated the loss of their power, and the Northern parliamentarians who demanded harsh penalties. William I used his crown's authority to maintain the balance, ensuring that the former Confederates could not oppress the freedmen, but also ensuring that the Southern economy was allowed to slowly recover. The Civil War solidified the American monarchy not just as a governmental structure, but as the moral conscience of the nation. It proved that the Crown, bound by the Constitution and dedicated to justice, was willing to pay the ultimate price to defend the principle of unity and the inherent dignity of all its subjects. William I's reign concluded with the nation unified, albeit scarred. He had saved the American experiment. He died in 1865, mere months after the war's end, exhausted but successful, leaving behind a nation ready to face the Second Industrial Revolution. His son, King Edward I, inherited a nation undergoing a tectonic shift. The late 19th century was defined by explosive economic growth, massive immigration waves, and the rise of corporate power, the era of the great industrial magnates. Edward I, a quiet, reform-minded intellectual, found himself in a new struggle: the battle between capital and labor. The economic reforms of the previous reigns had created an ideal environment for wealth creation, but they had also spawned monopolies and exploitative factory conditions. Edward I, deeply disturbed by the poverty he witnessed in the slums of New York and Chicago, focused his reign on regulating the excesses of capitalism and protecting the common worker. His most enduring legacy was the Royal Antitrust and Regulatory Act of 1880. This landmark legislation, fiercely opposed by the industrial barons like the oil tycoons and railroad chiefs, gave the Crown-appointed Federal Commerce Commission the power to break up monopolies and regulate interstate commerce. The king personally testified before Parliament, arguing that unchecked corporate power was just as tyrannical as a despotic king. The Constitution protects the citizen from the abuse of government power, he declared. The Crown must now act to protect the citizen from the abuse of commercial power. Edward I's reign was also the golden age of national parks and conservation. An avid naturalist, the king used his authority over royal lands to designate vast tracts of wilderness, Yosemite, Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, as royal preserves, protecting them from private development and ensuring that the natural majesty of America would be a birthright for all future citizens, not just a commodity to be exploited. In foreign policy, Edward I asserted American power on the world stage. He oversaw the rapid modernization of the Royal Navy and negotiated the Panama Canal Treaty, ensuring the American crown had exclusive rights to build and control the vital waterway, cementing American dominance in global trade. The monarchy, now a century old, had evolved into a stable, powerful institution. The kings, through their constitutional constraints, had become the nation's most effective check on extremism and corruption. George I established the framework,
John I secured the borders, William I defended the soul, and Edward I protected the economy and the land. The American monarchy, born from a desperate compromise, was now the strongest, most stable government in the Western world, poised to enter the 20th century as the definitive global superpower.